Hi, everyone. We're going to give it about one more minute to let people log on, and we'll get started right at 5 p.m. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Kelly Swick, and I work at the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, and we are thrilled to be hosting this webinar for Sea Otter Awareness Week. We have a fantastic presentation today by Dr. Annabel Beichman on sea otter genomics and population history. I'm going to turn it over to Annabel in just a few minutes, but first I wanted to introduce my organization and then pass it to Heather for some updates. So for those who don't know, San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance is an international nonprofit conservation organization. We have San Diego Zoo in San Diego, California, and San Diego Zoo Safari Park in Escondido, California. We also have conservation work that takes place all around the world that we've divided into 8 global conservation hubs, which you see on the screen now. Each hub supports key species, communities, and ecosystems in their regions. One of our hubs is focused on oceans and coastal regions.
I think we lost Kelly, unfortunately. Oh no, hopefully she'll be able to hop back on. Everyone who's watching, thank you for joining us. This is it's 5th day of Sea Otter Awareness Week. So we've had amazing events thus far. We're so excited to be here with San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, and hopefully Kelly will be able to pop back on. In the meantime, I think what I might try to do is, I don't have those slides, but I will give you guys a little bit of, oh, there she is. Hi, Kelly. No worries. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that, everyone. That's not what you want. Should I pick up where I left off, or did you transition?
You pick off where you left off, I think, and then we'll keep going. The beauty of live stream.
All right. Sorry about that, everyone. It's always the joy of these virtual presentations. Okay. All right. Oops. Can you see my screen?
Yes, there.
All right. Perfect. Sorry about that. All right. So of our 8 global conservation hubs, one of them is focused on oceans and coastal regions, and it's aptly named our Oceans Hub. We have a variety of projects that take place within this hub, including work on human polar bear coexistence in Arctic ecosystems, work on migratory birds and penguins in our coastal ecosystems, work on gathering health metrics for transient killer whale populations in the Salish Sea, and then finally, our kelp forest ecosystems, where we're building a portfolio of projects that support healthy nearshore ocean ecosystems and increase carbon sequestration. So we are here today to support our partners who have been working tirelessly and collaboratively to promote healthy sea otter populations and effective coexistence strategies with diverse communities. As a keystone species, sea otters are critical for maintaining healthy nearshore ocean ecosystems in the Eastern Pacific, especially in light of the degradation and loss of California's iconic kelp forest in the past decades. So we're really excited to be here and to be partnering with Sea Otter Savvy and all of the other fantastic organizations in Sea Otter Awareness Week. I'm going to pass it over to Heather Barrett for a few notes and updates.
Thank you so much, Kelly. We're so excited to be partnering with you guys on this event as well. Sea Otter Awareness Week occurs every year during the last full week of September, and it is organized in partnership with Defenders of Wildlife, Sea Otter Savvy, California State Parks, Alaka Alliance, and Monterey Bay Aquarium. And we thank all of the collaborators that join us in spreading awareness. This marks the 21st year, and the theme is Restoring Missing Links. So we are recognizing that sea otters remain absent from large portions of their historical range while celebrating the active efforts of conservation groups that are restoring a continuous population of these charismatic creatures and other missing elements along the Pacific coast. We also recognize that sea otters have influenced the livelihoods, culture, and spiritual aspects of coastal communities throughout human history. Many of these communities have their own words for sea otter, including the few that are appearing in the inner ring of the logo. One that it's a really wonderful design. I liked making that one this year. So hopefully everyone likes that one as well. This week also highlights Sea Otter Savvy's We Were Here Sea Otter program, which educates communities and stakeholders who are missing sea otters and offers a survey for community involvement. So the Southern Sea Otter Range is currently from Gaviota State Park in the south to a little north of Año Nuevo State Park in the north. Now, sea otters did once inhabit all along the Pacific coast. They are ecologically and culturally significant, and there is increasing discussion regarding possible reintroduction into historical habitats. So to move forward, government agencies, sea otter research community, we need to engage communities and stakeholders to hear your perspectives. If you are wondering what you can do today, please take the Sea Otter survey if you haven't already and share your thoughts on possible reintroduction. Your voice matters. Now, the links and the website and the survey will all be made available to you, I believe, in the chat function of the YouTube, and also will be posted with this video in the end. But with that, I'll pass it back to Kelly.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. I'm going to stop sharing and let Annabel cue up her slides while I give a brief introduction. So Dr. Annabel Beichman is a genomics researcher with a passion for marine conservation. She grew up body surfing in the Pacific Ocean in Los Angeles before heading to the East Coast to go to college at Harvard University. She came back to California as a graduate student at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she spearheaded the effort to sequence the sea otter genome and carried out genomic studies to understand the genetic impacts of the maritime fur trade on surviving sea otter populations. She's now a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Washington, Seattle, and she studies how DNA mutation and aging evolve across species. So without further ado, Annabel, I'll pass it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kelly, and for organizing everything. So much has been done behind the scenes, so it's really thrilling to be here to talk to you all. I'm really looking forward to telling you about sea otters and their genomes and some of my work and connecting it to sort of the themes of these missing links for Sea Otter Awareness Week. So Kelly did an awesome job introducing me. There's not much more I need to say. I just wanted to say that I really enjoy lots of aspects of biology, from being out in the field, there I am collecting whale poop samples, to being in the lab extracting DNA, to what I do really the majority of my time these days is be on the computer doing these genomic analyses of sea otters and other species. Today, I'll be giving you a lot of background about sea otter evolution and the impacts of the fur trade on sea otter populations. And then I'll tell you a little bit about genomics and how it can actually help us answer questions about sea otters and other species. And then I'll take you through some of my genomic findings, actually digging into some of these data for sea otters and what we've learned about their evolution and their population history. And at the end, we'll talk a bit more about those missing links that Heather mentioned and what we sort of still have to learn about these sea otters that used to be along the Pacific coast. Then we'll wrap up, and then I want to hear from all of you, and I'm really looking forward to trying to answer some of your questions. So let's dive right in. So sea otters evolved recently and rapidly to the marine environment. When I say recently, I mean in evolutionary timescales when you compare them to other marine mammal lineages. So if you look at some other types of marine mammals like manatees and dugongs or whales and dolphins, their ancestors entered the marine realm some 50 to 55 million years ago. So they've had a really long time to become really well adapted to life in the ocean. Seals and sea lions, their ancestors entered the marine realm some 30 million years ago, but sea otters are really the new kids on the block. They only entered the marine realm maybe 1 to 5 million years ago. So that's actually a blink of the eye in terms of evolutionary time, though of course it sounds like a long time to us. But in that short amount of time, sea otters have actually become extremely well adapted to this harsh environment. So those of you who've been scuba diving might know that for a human, it takes a lot to be comfortable in the ocean environment. If we want to go on a dive underwater, we need to take some extra air with us. We need some way to propel ourselves through the water with fins or paddles. We need some way to stay down and offset the buoyancy of that extra air. So divers might wear weight belts as ballast to keep themselves down low in the water. And perhaps most importantly, we need some form of temperature insulation because you're just going to be bleeding body heat in this cold environment unless you do something to insulate yourself. Sea otters don't have to stop at the local dive locker to accomplish this. They've actually evolved all these traits to be able to survive in the ocean environment and take really deep, long dives to forage for food. They've evolved expanded lungs that let them carry extra air on their dives. They have a paddle-like feet and tail. They have really dense limb bones that they actually seem to act as ballast for that buoyancy control to offset that extra air. Here I'm showing you a comparison between a ferret bone, a freshwater giant otter bone, and then the sea otter bone. And you can see that sea otter bone is shorter and denser and very highly mineralized. It's very dense and heavy. That helps them dive deep. But perhaps most remarkably, sea otters have evolved a form of temperature insulation in the form of water-resistant fur. This is the densest of any mammal's fur, and it's made up of interlocking hairs that trap air and keep sea otters warm. This is really different from all those other marine mammals I was showing you, whales and dugongs and seals. They all have a blubber layer, a layer of fat around their body that keeps them nice and toasty underwater. Sea otters don't have that fat layer. They rely entirely on their metabolism and on this incredible fur to stay warm in the ocean environment. Unfortunately for sea otters, humans noticed how great this fur is for staying warm and dry. And so this incredible adaptation that sea otters have to marine life almost led to the species extinction at the hands of the maritime fur trade. So sea otters used to be highly abundant everywhere you see the hatched lines on this map, from north of Japan all the way down to Baja California in Mexico. But when the maritime fur trade kicked off in 1741, sea otters were hunted to the verge of extinction. They were almost entirely wiped off this map. In areas where there had been tens of thousands of otters, there would only be a small group of survivors where I show these blue boxes, maybe 50 to 100 otters in each of these locations clinging on, and everywhere else they were really wiped out. This had sort of a huge impact on local ecosystems and on sea otter populations. It's thought that in California, there are only about 30 to 50 otters that survived. At first, people thought they'd been driven totally extinct. And then in the 30s, they actually found the sea otters that had made it through the fur trade in a really inaccessible part of the Big Sur coastline. This is actually a photo from that time period showing those survivors. And all sea otters alive in California today are the descendants of this tiny group of surviving sea otters that made it through the fur trade. As folks mentioned in the intro, sea otters are what we call a keystone species. They're really critical to coastal ecosystems. That's because sea otters eat sea urchins, and sea urchins like to eat kelp. And so if you take sea otters out of the equation, the urchins can really proliferate and run amok and just mow down a whole kelp forest. And that destroys a really incredible and important ecosystem that provides a habitat for fish and other marine mammals, nutrient exchange, carbon sequestration. All that goes away if you take sea otters out of the ecosystem. So it's really pivotally important to have sea otters to preserve these kelp forests. In 1911, efforts to conserve sea otters began. There was some great international cooperation through what's called the Fur Seal Treaty, which made sea otters no longer be hunted for fur commercially, with exceptions made for indigenous Aleut or Ainu traditional hunts. That legislation got strengthened in the 70s with the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, further bolstering protections for sea otters. And along the way, long-term monitoring and scientific research on sea otter health, ecosystem impacts, and population growth began to try to understand the impacts these animals have on their ecosystems and what their population dynamics are. So I really like to think of sea otters as an ongoing conservation success in many areas where they're protected. Some of these tiny remnant populations have blossomed back up to the tens of thousands in Alaska, Russia, and Japan. So they're back up to sort of numbers that we might think of before the fur trade, and that's really incredible. In California, it's going a bit more slowly. They're back up to about 3,000 otters, which is great compared to the 30 to 50 that made it through the fur trade, but maybe not back up as high as they used to be. But we still have to remain vigilant. There's a lot of threats to sea otter populations still. There can be a lack of food or habitat availability. There can be predation by sharks or orcas. They're very vulnerable to oil spills and disease spillover from land. So this is really something that's an incredible success, but also something that's an ongoing effort and requires continued monitoring and management. So why do I study sea otter genomics? It's not just because they're cute. It's because they are this very remarkable and recent evolutionary transition from a sort of freshwater coastal animal becoming a marine mammal. And we were really interested if we could catch any of that sort of in the act in their genomes. They also represent this amazing and sort of tragic natural experiment where they were all hunted to the verge of extinction at the same time, independently across this entire species range from Japan to Mexico. And we were curious as to whether we could actually learn more about that event using genomic tools. Finally, as I mentioned, they are this keystone species that are critical to coastal ecosystems. And so we wondered whether there were continued risks that they might face having gone through this experience in the fur trade of being so badly bottlenecked as a population. And we wondered whether genetics can sort of aid in future management decisions. So before I take you through what we did to try to address some of those questions, I want to tell you a little bit about genomes and genomic science. So genomes are really the blueprints of life. Inside every one of your cells in the cell nucleus is a big tangle of DNA containing your genome. And in humans, that's made up of 23 paired chromosomes. And the letters of DNA, these nucleotides that we encode in the computer as A's, T's, C's, and G's, contain all the instructions to be a human, or in the case of the sea otter, to be a sea otter. Our human genomes and sea otter genomes are about 3 billion of these little DNA letters long. They're incredibly long. But before we get too cocky about that, the plant Paris japonica is 150 billion base pairs long. So just knowing the genome size doesn't actually tell you that much about the complexity of the organism. Within our genomes are what we call genes. These are little snippets of the genome that actually encode the instructions to make proteins to make a human happen or make a sea otter happen. But these are actually sort of scattered throughout the genome and only make up about 1% to 2% of the actual sequence of the genome. Humans have about 20,000 of these genes that encode proteins in our genome. But again, before we get too cocky, water fleas have 30,000 genes. So it doesn't, your total number of genes also doesn't tell you much about how complex you are as an organism. Because we are all part of this incredible branching evolutionary tree of life, we actually share a lot of genes with other organisms. And by looking at genes that are in common across organisms and small alterations that have happened to them over evolutionary time, we can learn a lot about what makes particular species evolutionarily special. And this is an icon from 23andMe where you can think about what percentage of your genes you actually share with other species. And maybe it makes sense, okay, we share like 98% with chimps, but you also share about 18% with plants. So some of these genes go really deep back on this evolutionary tree. I kind of like to think of genomes as a huge and beautiful library, but when you open up a book, you just see this total gibberish. And it's the job of us as genomicists to see if we can actually pull out information from this gibberish and learn something from this dense library. So this is what I set out to do for the sea otter for the first time. So I sequenced, assembled, and annotated the southern sea otter genome. Like humans, it's about 3 billion of those DNA letters long. And I did this based on a sample from an otter named Gidget, who lived at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. I started with a blood sample that veterinarians took from Gidget during a routine medical exam. I extracted the DNA from her blood. I chopped it up into pieces that are about 150 of those letters long. So imagine taking something that's 3 billion letters long and chopping it up into 150 letter chunks. We then throw it on a sequencing machine that sequences each of those chunks, reads all those letters many, many, many times over. And then it's the job of a bunch of computers all linked together, working in parallel to try to sort of put Humpty Dumpty back together again, take all those pieces of DNA and get them back in the right order so that we can actually get the sequence of Gidget's genome. And this is a huge computational effort. Finally, we actually want to go through all that sequence and find where those genes are, those genes that are hidden around the genome. And we do this using computational models to predict where they are and using that similarity to other species that I was talking about. And so that we went through the genome and used information from ferrets and dogs and cats and other models to try to find where those genes are located. After all that work, the Sea Otter genome is actually available for anyone to explore. You can go on the UC Santa Cruz genome browser, where they host genomes of so many different species, everything from zebrafish to rhinos to dogs to the southern sea otter, and actually click around and explore the genome yourself. So that's a resource that's there for everyone. So what were we actually looking for now that we have this amazing genome to work with? Well, I was really interested if we could detect any genomic signals of these incredible sea otter adaptations that let them survive and thrive in the marine realm. So we did this by comparing those genes we found in the sea otter genome to a bunch of other species who they're related to. So what this tree is showing you are evolutionary relatives of the sea otter. You can see the closest one on this tree is the freshwater giant otter. They're about 10 million years diverged from sea otters, but it goes all the way out to tigers or pangolins, sort of a divergence time of more like 85 million years from the sea otter. But by lining up those genes across all these species and looking for what's different in the genes of sea otters, we can start to try to find genetically what is underlying sea otters' incredible adaptations. I'm just going to do a short summary of what we found, since we could go on about this all day. But one thing we were really interested in is that we found signals of changes in sea otter genes related to bone density, brain development, reproduction, and immune function. Bone density was one we were most excited about. Remember, I showed you this picture before about just how dense and highly mineralized sea otter bones are in order to enable them to dive deep. And we think we actually detected the changes in particular genes that might underlie this amazing adaptation. We, of course, really wanted to know what genes, changes in genes might underlie the amazing fur of sea otters. And what we found is not one or two big changes in one or two genes, but we actually found a lot of really little subtle changes across a great many genes related to hair follicle development. And we think that that might actually be the sort of secret to their amazing fur, is not that they've had one single change happen, but that there was actually a widespread change across the genome in lots of different genes that ultimately lead to this incredible fur. Finally, we also were interested in what sea otters were losing as they went to the marine realm, not just what they were gaining. And we know from other marine mammals like dolphins that the sense of smell is not very important underwater. Dolphins have lost almost all their genes related to the ability to smell, and they have almost no sense of smell. And we thought, well, sea otters are pretty new to this whole marine mammal life. Have they lost any of their, scent genes? What we found is that sea otters have lost hundreds of their genes related to the sense of smell, but they've also retained a great deal more. So they're not nearly as sort of fully evolved into marine mammaldom as a dolphin is, where they've just totally lost that sense of smell, but they have begun to lose it compared to their terrestrial relatives. And so that was a really cool kind of snapshot of the sort of intermediate marine mammal evolution of the sea otter. And maybe if we checked in on them in another 20 million years, they might have lost a lot more of those scent-related genes. So we next really wanted to understand if we can detect the impact of the fur trade using sea otter genomes. To do this, one genome was not enough. We needed more sea otter genomes from across this whole remnant colony range, all the way from the Kuril Islands north of Japan down to California. So we got sea otter genetic samples from all across these locations with at least 7 individuals from each place and up to 40 in some locations. And once you've had one genome sequence, it's a lot easier to sequence more. So that's why it was so important to do that first genome really well. And then we could do these additional sea otter genomes to learn more about their more recent population history. This is an analysis from humans that we wanted to replicate in sea otters. So in humans, these are genome samples from people of European ancestry. And each point on this plot represents a person, and the closer it is to another point, the more genetically similar they are. The more far apart, the more genetically different they are. And what you can see are you get these sort of distinct colored clusters on this plot that actually really tally, if you kind of tilt your head, with the map of Europe, that people from Spain tend to be more closely related to other people from Spain, people from France to other people from France, and so on. So this human genetic differentiation is really reflecting the geography of Europe. So we wondered what this might look like for sea otters. Here again, each point is an individual sea otter, and the closer the points are, the more genetically similar they are, and I've colored them by where they're sampled from. And what you can see is just like the humans in Europe, this really reflects the geography of these sea otter populations, that they are more closely related to otters from their same area, and it sort of almost perfectly recreates this map and this geography in the North Pacific, which is really amazing. Just like humans, the sea otters are more closely related to sea otters from where they're from and to neighboring populations. You don't see California in this map because it kind of squishes things. So if you add California to this analysis, it's really genetically distinct. The sea otters from California are genetically distinct from all of these other populations. And that's really interesting because we know California is sort of isolated at this point geographically from all these other groups as well. And it seems like genetically, it's also quite unique. So we know the fur trade caused a bottleneck in sea otter populations. A bottleneck is when a population rapidly decreases in size. And it's named because it's sort of, you could picture like a wine bottle where it goes from being sort of a large body to very quickly becoming the bottleneck. And bottlenecks are not great for populations. They can reduce genetic diversity, they can increase the frequency of harmful genetic variants, they can lead to increased inbreeding in this small population. So it's generally not a good thing to go through a population bottleneck. And so we wanted to understand if we could actually infer how intense this bottleneck had been for sea otters. We're actually able to do this because genomes in people alive today, or sea otters alive today, actually carry the history of these population size changes of their ancestors hidden inside them. So by sequencing genomes of sea otters today, we can actually learn about the history of the population that came before them. And so we were actually able to make a model of sea otter population history where we could infer the size of sea otter populations prior to the fur trade and then during the fur trade and get a sense of just how extreme this event was. What we found is a really similar pattern across all the populations we had sampled, again, all the way from Japan to California, of a crash. And a very intense population crash where only sort of 2 to 13% of the population survived. And this is really concordant with sort of the historical records of the fur trade, but here we're just pulling it out of their genetics. And the fact that the fur trade left such a strong genomic signal in all these surviving sea otter populations shows us just how extreme an event it was and how catastrophic it was for these sea otter populations that made it through. We were also interested in what the genetic profile of sea otters from before the fur trade looked like in California. So we teamed up with some fantastic archaeologists to look at sea otter samples from 300 to 1600 years ago and see if we could get some DNA out of them. So when you're working with ancient DNA, you have to be really cautious to avoid modern contamination. So here I am in the ancient DNA lab, all spacesuited up to work with these very sensitive samples. And what we found is that these ancient California samples are genetically very similar to the modern California samples that we had sequenced. There wasn't any sort of genetic turnover with different sea otters sort of replacing otters in California. The ones that are there today have a very similar genetic profile to the ones that were there before the fur trade. There was this continuity in this area. So I've been talking a lot about sea otters that made it through the fur trade. Their ancestors made it through the fur trade. But what about the real theme of Sea Otter Awareness Week, which is the lost sea otter populations, the missing links that aren't there anymore? Let's talk a bit about them. So I showed you this map before where I showed you that sea otters manage to survive everywhere there are these blue boxes, but there are these huge stretches of coastline where no sea otters survived at all, and they're completely missing. There's no, remnant population, even at 30 otters to try to come back from. There were attempts to sort of repopulate sea otters in these areas in the 70s. Otters were translocated from Prince William Sound and the Aleutian Islands to fill in sort of areas around Southeast Alaska and British Columbia. Those were very successful. Otters were also moved from sort of the Monterey area down to San Nicolas Island in Southern California. So these were sort of human-driven attempts to start to fill back in these missing links, and those have worked very well. But there are still some regions of the coast, particularly around Oregon and southern Washington, where there aren't any sea otters at all. There's a lot we really don't know about these lost sea otter populations. For instance, we don't know if the otters in Washington, Oregon were genetically more similar to sea otters in California or to the ones in Alaska, or were they sort of perfectly intermediate? And that's a really intriguing question. We also don't know much about the otters down in Baja California in Mexico. Were they similar to those in California, sort of interconnected with them, or were they really their own distinct population with its own genetic profile? And we just have no idea. This brings me to a sort of story about those Baja sea otters that I like to call the mystery of the Baja California sea otters. Because even though we think from historical records and monitoring that they were totally wiped out from this area, researchers and fishermen are starting to see sea otters in Baja California. And there's this really interesting question as to whether those sea otters that they're observing could possibly be survivors of the lost Baja California sea otter population, or are they recent migrants coming down from Southern California, likely from the sort of San Nicolas translocated population? And so we teamed up with an awesome set of researchers down in Mexico, Dr. Gisela Heckel, Yolanda Schramm, Sergio Niguel Morales, and Andres Moreno Estrada, to answer this using genomics. So Gisela and Yolanda managed to get tissue samples of sea otters from Baja, and Sergio did the genome sequencing and the analysis with me so that we could figure out what was going on. And what we found using genome sequencing is that the sea otters sampled from Baja are really genetically the same as the sea otters we have sampled in California. There's no sort of distinction between them. And so it seems much more likely that sea otters from California are actually sort of under their own steam starting to recolonize Baja, which is quite a distance, sort of 400 to 600 kilometers. It's a non-trivial distance of coastline that they're covering, but that seems more likely than that these otters are actual survivors of the original Baja California population. This is still really cool because it means that sea otters are sort of taking it upon themselves to restore this missing link down in Mexico, and they're heading down there. And so maybe with some international cooperation and management, eventually there could actually be maybe a stable sea otter colony down there, which would be really incredible. Unfortunately, this doesn't tell us anything about what the original Baja sea otters were like. We would need some form of pre-fur trade samples from Baja to try to understand more about the otters that used to live there, rather than these new ones that are sort of taking themselves down there from California. But really, what about those lost populations in Oregon and Washington? We're learning more about Baja, but we still don't know that much about these. In my research, I was able to do some population modeling based on my samples from Alaska and California to look at when those two populations, Alaska and California, may have diverged some 28,000 years ago. And I also inferred that there seemed to be low but non-zero amounts of genetic information flowing between Alaska and California. So that points to some amount of connectivity along this coastline. Not that a single otter would ever make it from Alaska down to California, but its genetic material might slowly work its way down over the generations. But this really doesn't tell us much about the lost populations in between, these missing links that just aren't there anymore. This is not work that I have done, but there's some really interesting ancient DNA work being done to try to help fill in the gaps in our knowledge about those missing populations. There's a study by Valentine and colleagues and Wellman and colleagues that are starting to use those ancient DNA techniques that I was talking about with our work in California. They're doing that with samples from Oregon. But the results are still not quite conclusive. One study pointed to these lost otters being more California-like, but a more recent study points to them being more Alaska-like. So it's still sort of an ongoing question as to genetically what these lost populations were like along the Oregon coastline. So we really need more samples, more ancient genomes to try to figure this out and actually solve this conundrum. You might be wondering why this matters, who cares what they were like, but you can imagine if we wanted to fill in this missing link at some point in the future, what sea otters would best restore it? Should they be brought down from Alaska or brought up from California? And it'd be really nice if they could sort of match as closely as possible the genetic profile of the otters that used to live there. And so that's why this is sort of a really interesting ongoing research question. And I imagine with more ancient DNA work being done, we'll probably get more clarity on this in the future. So I want to recap a bit of what we've talked about today. We've talked about how sea otters are evolutionary newcomers to the marine realm, and we can detect changes in their genome that reflects this. Sea otter remnant populations are genetically distinct. They're all their own sort of little genetic profile, which is extremely cool. We use sea otter genomics to actually estimate just how severely the fur trade impacted all those remnant populations, all the way from Japan to California, really underscoring what a catastrophic event this was for sea otters. It seems like sea otters from California might be heading down to Baja, restoring a missing link under their own steam, which is pretty amazing. And we still don't know for sure what sea otters were like in those lost populations, those missing links were like genetically, but ancient DNA may be starting to provide some answers and clues. I wanted to point out that we've actually been starting to apply similar methods that I use in the sea otter study to other marine mammals. So with my colleagues Sergio and Meishi, we worked to actually try to detect the legacy of whaling in fin whale genomes. So much in the same way we detected the impact of the fur trade on sea otters, Sergio and Meishi were able to detect just how severely whaling impacted fin whales. My colleagues Jacqueline and Chris sequenced genomes of the vaquita porpoise. This is the most endangered marine mammal in the world. There's only about 12 of them left. And they tried to examine this question of whether vaquita are actually doomed genetically due to their small population size, or whether they could actually recover from this bottleneck that they're currently going through. So it's really great to see these methods used more broadly to other marine mammals, to other species, and be applied more widely. Finally, just here, I want to sort of end with a bit of a reflection for Sea Otter Awareness Week, thinking about how each of us can maybe make a difference. And this is a quote from Dr. Carl Safina, a famous ecologist, that I come back to over and over when I start to lose hope, when the headlines just seem too awful and it's hard to sort of come back to conservation work. But what Dr. Safina said was, when we collectively do decide not to let animals be driven into that eternal void, it works. Conservation efforts have reversed near certain oblivion for more than 24 birds, various mammals from rodents to whales, and dozens of others. No one worked on all of those successes, but someone worked on each of them. And that's what made the difference. So this Sea Otter Awareness Week, I really urge you to think about how you can maybe make a difference to the species or ecosystems you care about. And if we all do that collectively, hopefully that will make a big difference. Finally, I just want to really thank the San Diego Zoo and the Sea Otter Savvy teams for organizing this webinar. It's such a privilege to get to talk to all of you, and I'm so grateful to Heather and Taylor and Kelly and Gina and everyone who's been working behind the scenes to make this happen. Finally, big studies like this with samples all the way from Japan to Mexico don't just happen on their own. I have been working with an amazing set of collaborators and sample collectors and mentors and advisors and funders to make all this happen. And I'm so grateful to the many, many people listed on this slide for making this happen. But now this is enough for me. I really want to hear your questions and know what you want to know about sea otter genomes, and I'll turn it over to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Annabelle. That was amazing. And thank you for ending on such an inspirational note. It's always really nice to see that and get a little ocean optimism. So yeah, thank you for that. We have some questions rolling in from the chat. So I'm just going to start you out with the first question. Before the fur trade, were sea otter populations genetically connected?
Oh, that's such a great question, Kelly. Thank you. Yes, so we did some analyses that I didn't have time to show today, where we looked particularly at those northern and Asian populations from Japan to Alaska. What we found was sort of a complex interconnectivity prior to the fur trade that moved in both directions along those island chains. So this wouldn't be an otter swimming from Japan to Alaska, but maybe one otter in its lifetime moved to the next population over, interbred, exchanged some genetic material, maybe its descendant sometime later moved over and moved over. And so there did seem to be some sort of interplay between those populations. And that's sort of intriguing when we think about these missing links, because we don't know whether the whole coast from Alaska to Mexico was also similarly interconnected, but it seems like at least elsewhere in the Sea Otter range, that is sort of the behavior. So maybe that gives us some clues about the missing links as well.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is, does the small ancestral population of Californian sea otters have any negative effect on the general genome of sea otters?
Oh, that's such a great question. Yeah. So going through a population bottleneck is not great for you. We did some sort of really cool simulations based on the population history we inferred for all of these sea otter populations that went through these crashes. And what we found is that it does likely raise the sort of level of harmful genetic variation in the population. So it makes otters that have survived the fur trade and their descendants sort of less genetically fit than their ancestors were prior to the fur trade. The good news is in our simulations is that we didn't find it to be so extreme that it would drive them extinct just due to those genetic factors. There's all those other threats to sea otters we have to keep an eye on, but just that elevated, what we call genetic load, wouldn't be enough to drive them extinct.
Thanks so much, Annabelle. We have a few questions around the topic of, do sea otter populations have unique adaptations for their local environment?
That's a great question. It's something I think we all really want to know. So from the genetics, it's really challenging to detect something like that because of the fur trade bottleneck, because they lost so much diversity. It's actually really hard for us to detect if there was something, sort of good in their genome that was making them really specialized to their one location. But there's enough sort of differences in the type of diet and foraging habitat along these coastlines that I don't think it's far-fetched at all to think that they have specialized adaptations. And that's one reason I think people really want to know what those missing link sea otters were like genetically, is perhaps they did have some localized adaptations. And at least maybe if you could sort of replace them with their closest genetic relatives, maybe there's a chance that those adaptations are still there.
Great, thank you. So you had mentioned that you were able to sample sea otters from 1,000 years ago to, that were local to California. Have any ancient sea otter remains been collected from Mexico so that you could kind of do that comparison to see if the populations you're seeing there are part of it, or are there no samples from back then?
That's a great question. I didn't have any in my collection with the archaeologists I was working with. I would love to have some. With ancient DNA, the colder the area, the best chance you have of getting good ancient DNA out. That's why some of the best ancient DNA work is actually from the permafrost in the far north, where samples have been really cold for a really long time, that DNA is preserved. So the sort of closer to the equator you get, the warmer you get, the harder it is for that ancient DNA to make it. But that is something I think would be really incredible to do, is to be able to get that ancient DNA from Mexico. And I think techniques are getting better and better, and more archaeology is happening. So it's not impossible by any means.
That would be exciting to be able to make those comparisons like you did here. Are California southern sea otters genetically similar enough to mate with other northern sea otter populations?
That's a really great question. I don't know if anyone's tried, but I suspect they'd probably be okay. They're technically just subspecies, not actually different species. And we actually did some simulations to see sort of would that be genetically good or bad if they were able to mate. And one cool thing is if you could get otters from different bottlenecked populations to interbreed, you actually can much more quickly get rid of that elevated genetic load that they built up through the fur trade. So those translocations that mixed otters from Prince William Sound and the Aleutian Islands, that's actually a really good design because it actually probably helped them eliminate that harmful variation more quickly. I think there's a lot of legislative barriers. Heather might be able to speak to this between mixing northern and southern sea otters, so it might not be logistically feasible, but at least from like a genetic standpoint, it actually could be good for them.
Great, thank you. You had mentioned sort of early on in your presentation that this genomic information can be really, really important for, managing some sort of sea otter protections or policy or things like that going forward. Do you know if there's any plans to do that, or how the information that you and your collaborators have gleaned could inform policy to protect sea otters going forward?
Yeah, I believe, I mean, there are often sort of legislation rules around like levels of genetic diversity that are considered healthy or not. It's also, often sea otters are managed as different sort of stocks that were, I think, originally defined before there was genetics, and then work by Sean Larson and others have increasingly been showing that the way we sort of define these subspecies and define these stocks doesn't necessarily tally with the genetics. It either like lumps a lot of groups together or leaves some out that should belong. And certainly our genetic work, seeing that each of these remnant populations is really genetically distinct, makes me think maybe they each need to be managed slightly separately. But I think, that's something where we always want to be communicating back and forth with policymakers and managers to make sure the information is being communicated and hopefully is useful.
Yeah, that's great. It's always really nice to see those sort of applications of the incredible science and the data that you collect and how it can be, applied in policy. So that's fantastic. We have a question here. To reintroduce southern sea otters to Northern California, what genetic considerations should we keep in mind?
Oh, that's interesting to have them sort of move further up from Monterey over. So that's a really good question. I mean, I think it seems likely to me that the otters that used to be further north in California probably were genetically somewhat similar to the ones that live around, more central Monterey, California now. Some of our ancient DNA work kind of points to that because we had samples from truly Southern California and from the Monterey area, and they seem similar to each other and similar to otters that are there today. So I wouldn't have really much genetic concern with that. I think there's probably more logistical and legislative and stakeholder concerns about that.
Thank you. So we have a question here. Would we increase genetic variation and diversity by using otters from different areas in the California range, so north versus south, versus pulling animals from the same area?
Great question. So all the otters in California, they are all descended from that 30 to 50 that survived the fur trade. So, there's not like a ton of variation within the range. That was such a recent bottleneck that even though that's great that they're now expanding, not enough time has really gone by for them to build up any sort of north-south differences yet between even like that translocated San Nicolas colony and the original ones up in Monterey. So I think at least as long as you're sticking with only southern sea otters in California, what we've got is sort of what we got in terms of the genetic diversity.
Yeah, that makes sense. You may have answered a similar question, but we have one here. Are there any harmful genetic consequences of the fur trade bottleneck for sea otters moving forward?
Yeah, that's great. We touched on it a little bit, but I'm happy to expand on that a little bit. So what our simulations indicate is that sea otters and all these remnant populations moving forward do have this increased what we call genetic load, the sort of burden in the population of harmful genetic variants. And this can happen because these variants exist, but maybe in a big population, you only have one copy of that variant. But once your population gets small, everyone's a little bit more related. Sometimes you hear about how, human populations that have been bottlenecked maybe have more incidence of genetic disease, things like that. So that can happen where you inherit two copies of a not very good genetic variant, and that can sort of lower the fitness of the population as a whole. And so our simulations indicate that that likely has occurred for all sea otters. No sea otter population sort of would have made it unscathed by this. But the fact that the bottleneck was short and that they are sort of pulling out of it pretty quickly is good for them. It means it's not so catastrophic that they would go extinct due to these genetic problems. But the sad thing in our simulations is that, you know, they'll be stuck with this elevated load for hundreds of generations. It's really, really slow to erode. And if they go through any subsequent bottlenecks, that'll just bring it right back up where it was and keep it in the population. So it's important to sort of keep them recovering, keep them going. Really, the only thing we found in our simulations that would drop it much more quickly, as I mentioned, is maybe crossing individuals from different bottlenecked populations like Prince William Sound and the Aleutian Islands. If you cross them like they did in those translocations, that could maybe drop it out more quickly.
So interesting. Sort of along that note, we have another question. So knowing that the goal is to increase genetic diversity in southern sea otters, should we also be considering their uniqueness from other populations which seems to have persisted?
I think that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, they're clearly genetically distinct. I'm guessing just due to isolation. Like, I bet if we had genomes of every otter along sort of that missing link from all those other populations, there would probably be a gradient leading to California, and they wouldn't seem maybe quite so weird on those plots. But given that we only have California left, I do think it's maybe important to manage them differently and maybe try to preserve that unique genetic profile, particularly if it does also come with perhaps some local adaptation.
Great, thanks. So this is the last question that I have. So if anyone has any last burning questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But I actually really like this one also to sort of end cap this, which is, what is next for your research and your collaborators?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'm up in Seattle right now, and I'm sort of taking a sea otter hiatus. I work actually right now on how DNA mutations occur across many different species, including many marine mammals. We want to sort of understand how it is that whales are able to live to be 80 or 90 years old and not get cancer when they have these huge body sizes. And so I'm really starting to now sort of be kind of deep in the plumbing of evolution, trying to understand how these processes evolve. But I still am in touch with a lot of Sea Otter collaborators. There's some great Sea Otter genome sequencing happening at UC Santa Cruz. There's more of that ancient DNA work I mentioned ongoing. And then some really interesting work in Elkhorn Slough looking at relatedness. So Sea Otter genomics is alive and well, and some great projects are coming.
Awesome. Good to hear. We look forward to hearing more from you about your work in the future also. I did have another question come in which is, did the split happen at a similar time across the geographic areas, or was there possibly a single split in one location and then sea otters dispersed from there and evolved separately after?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So yeah, thinking about sort of how they spread out. Yeah, I don't think we quite have a great sense of sort of the directionality. We were sort of able to reconstruct sort of a tree of the different relatedness between the populations. I think one thing that's interesting is that the timing of the split we estimate between Alaska and California coincides with the last glacial maximum, when most of that coastline would have been sort of covered in ice and glaciers. And you could imagine that sort of prompting some splits and some isolation maybe between otters in the north and the south. And so I'm intrigued by sort of that sort of glacial phenomenon maybe also contributing to their isolation.
Great. Thank you so much. So that is all we were able to tackle all of the questions in the chat. So thank you so much for doing that. And thank you to everyone for tuning in and for watching and for sending in these fantastic questions. I think it really created such a nice dialogue, and we were able to hear a little bit more about all the different aspects of your work. So thank you so much. This was incredible to hear from you and your work. I could listen to it all day. So I really appreciate you you're sharing your expertise with us. And San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance is just so happy to be a part of this event. So thank you to everyone for inviting us and allowing us to host. And it was fantastic to meet you, Annabel. Really appreciate it. There's several more events this week, so I'm going to pass it over to Heather for any final reminders and to touch base on the survey. But thank you again so much to everyone for your time and your engagement. It's been really fantastic. And thank you, of course, Dr. Annabel Beichman. Really appreciate it.
Thank you,
Yes.
Kelly, and thanks everyone for the great questions.
Yeah, thank you, Annabelle. It was absolutely fascinating. We love hearing you speak. Your work is amazing. And thank you, Kelly, and San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance for hosting this event with us. And just a reminder to everyone, Sea Otter Awareness Week is not yet done. There's still 2 more days. There's an event on Friday as well as Saturday. You can visit the calendar events, which we can have posted back in there for the chat for you guys. And don't forget, if you are interested in participating in the discussion around potential reintroduction and understanding the historical range of sea otters and where they were in the past, please visit our We Were Here Sea Otter program under Sea Otter Savvy, get involved, and you can take that survey. So please share your voice if you haven't already. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye.